My parents handed out $50,000 trust funds and solid gold watches to every single grandchild in the room. But when my 5-year-old daughter excitedly opened her Easter basket, she found a single cheap plastic egg. She popped it open, but it was completely empty. She pulled my sleeve and whispered, "Mama, did I do something bad?" I did not cry. I did not scream. I quietly took her hand and walked out the door while my family laughed at my retreat. But they had absolutely no idea that by 9 o'clock the next morning, I would take everything they owned. Before I tell you how I turned their $3 million mansion into an active crime scene and fired my own arrogant brother-in-law in less than 60 seconds, hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. You will not want to miss the look of pure terror on my mother's face when her elite black card was declined. My name is Lauren, 33 years old, and I am a senior forensic accountant at one of the most ruthless private equity firms in New York City. But to my toxic family, I am just the pathetic college dropout who completely ruined her own life. The air at my parents' Connecticut estate always smelled of expensive jasmine and old money arrogance. It was Easter Sunday, the one day a year my father Richard and my mother Barbara demanded absolute attendance from their children. They needed to project the image of a perfect wealthy family to their country club friends. Their massive $3 million mansion sat on rolling green hills, a monument to their supposed business acumen. I stood near the edge of the sprawling stone patio, holding a glass of sparkling water, entirely invisible to the people who shared my bloodline. In the center of the patio, my brother-in-law DeAndre held court. DeAndre is a 34-year-old investment banker, an Ivy League graduate, and a prominent African-American financier who married my younger sister Brittany. He was loudly bragging about the custom leather interior of his brand-new Porsche, swirling a glass of scotch as if he owned the entire world. My older brother Cameron and his wife Allison hung on his every word, nodding eagerly and laughing at jokes that were not funny, desperate to catch any financial advice or favor DeAndre might throw their way. Brittany stood beside him, dripping in designer labels, looking at me with her signature expression of sheer disdain. They all viewed me as the family charity case. 10 years ago, my husband passed away suddenly. I was only 23, completely broken by grief, and forced to drop out of college to survive. My parents swooped in, claiming they would handle all the complicated paperwork while I grieved. They told everyone I was too fragile, too uneducated, and too unstable to manage my own affairs. I had spent the last decade letting them believe that lie. I let them think I was scraping by on minimum wage, living in a tiny apartment, barely keeping my head above water. Barbara clapped her manicured hands together, the heavy diamond rings on her fingers catching the afternoon sunlight. She announced that it was time for the grandchildren to receive their holiday gifts. The patio quieted down as my parents took their places on the grand wicker furniture. Cameron and Allison pushed their two sons forward. Brittany nudged her perfectly dressed twins toward their grandparents. My own daughter Lily stood quietly by my side, her bright eyes wide with innocent excitement. Richard handed out heavy velvet boxes to Cameron's sons. Inside were limited edition luxury watches. Barbara handed Brittany's children thick linen envelopes. She announced loudly that she and Richard had set up $50,000 trust funds for each of them to ensure their bright futures. The adults cheered and clapped. DeAndre boasted that his kids were already building an empire before kindergarten. Then Barbara turned her gaze toward us. Her smile was tight and completely devoid of warmth. She reached into a generic plastic grocery bag, resting beside her chair, and pulled out a cheap neon yellow plastic egg. She tossed it casually onto the glass coffee table. It rolled and stopped near my feet. Lily looked up at me, seeking permission. I gave her a small nod. She stepped forward and picked up the egg. Her tiny fingers struggled with the plastic seam for a moment before it popped open. It was completely empty. No chocolate, no small toy, no trust fund envelope, just empty plastic. The patio went dead silent. Lily stared at the empty halves in her hands. Her bottom lip trembled. She walked back to me, pulled on the sleeve of my cheap cardigan, and asked if she was a bad girl. My heart shattered into a million pieces, but I forced my face to remain absolute stone. I looked directly at Barbara. My mother took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne and sighed loudly. "Oh, Lauren," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I simply forgot you were bringing Lily today. I assumed you would be working a double shift at whatever dead-end job you managed to keep this month. You really should have planned better and given us a heads up." DeAndre let out a loud, mocking snort. He crossed his arms and stared at me. "Maybe if you applied yourself instead of waiting for handouts, your kid would get something better than plastic," he said. Cameron chuckled, adding that I had always been the black sheep who expected everyone else to carry my weight. Allison whispered something to Brittany, and they both laughed behind their hands. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not give them the satisfaction of an emotional breakdown. I looked at the mansion behind them, the massive columns and pristine windows. I knew exactly how they bought that house. I knew exactly where DeAndre got the seed money to start his arrogant investment fund. I had spent the last 3 years tracking every hidden offshore account, every forged signature, and every stolen asset they thought they had buried 10 years ago when my husband died. I knelt down to Lily's height and smoothed her hair. "You are perfect, my sweet girl," I told her clearly so everyone could hear. "We are going to go get the biggest ice cream in the city." I stood up, took her hand, and turned my back on them. "Lauren, get back here," Richard barked, his voice echoing across the stone patio. "Do not storm off like a petulant child when your mother is speaking to you. You need to learn some respect for the people who put a roof over your head." I did not stop walking. I did not look back. I led Lily down the long driveway toward my beat-up sedan. Behind me, I could hear them mocking my departure. Brittany called me a coward. DeAndre laughed and told Richard to let the failure run away. They felt incredibly powerful in that moment, entirely convinced of their superiority and untouchable wealth. As I walked down the driveway, my mind was not on the insult. It was calculating the exact figures of their impending ruin. 10 years ago, my brilliant husband wrote a revolutionary predictive algorithm for financial markets. When he died, my parents drugged me with grief medication and handed me a stack of legal papers claiming they were just handling the hospital bills. I signed blindly, giving them total power of attorney. They took the multi-million-dollar payout from his life insurance to purchase this exact estate. Worse, they transferred the rights to his algorithm to a shell corporation controlled by DeAndre for absolute pennies. DeAndre used that stolen technology to launch his fund, turning himself into a self-made millionaire on the back of a dead man's genius. I strapped Lily into her car seat and smiled. They thought they had won. They had absolutely no idea that I was simply heading back to my hidden luxury apartment in Manhattan to make a phone call to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The drive back to the city was quiet. Lily fell asleep in the back seat, clutching her empty plastic egg. I did not throw it away. I needed it as a reminder. I pulled my rusted 10-year-old sedan into the private underground parking garage of a sleek glass-enclosed high-rise in Tribeca. I unbuckled my daughter, carried her to the private elevator, and scanned my thumbprint on the biometric panel. The door slid open to reveal my actual life. My family genuinely believed I lived in a cramped, rat-infested studio apartment in Queens. They believed my tragic sob story of working minimum-wage retail jobs just to keep the lights on. They never bothered to verify anything, because checking on my well-being would require them to actually care. Instead, I stepped onto the heated marble floors of my 4,000-square-foot top-floor penthouse overlooking the Hudson River. I am not a college dropout struggling to survive. After my husband passed away, I transferred my credits, changed my name slightly to drop my maiden name, and finished my degree in finance online while working night shifts. Today, I am a senior forensic accountant for one of the most aggressive private equity firms on Wall Street. My daily job consists of tearing apart the financial records of corrupt billionaires, finding their hidden offshore accounts, and legally dismantling their empires during hostile corporate takeovers. I destroy untouchable men for a living, and tomorrow I am going to destroy my own family. I carried Lily into her bedroom, carefully tucking her under a custom silk duvet. She stirred slightly, whispering in her sleep about the Easter Bunny. I kissed her forehead, closed her door, and walked straight to my home office. The room was dark, illuminated only by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows displaying the city skyline. I walked over to a seemingly blank wall panel, pressed my hand against the hidden scanner, and watched the wood panel slide back to reveal a heavy fireproof wall safe. I punched in a 12-digit code, turned the heavy dial, and pulled the steel door open. Inside sat 3 years of absolute obsession. I pulled out a thick leather-bound folder and dropped it heavily onto my glass desk. I opened it, the harsh glow of my desk lamp illuminating pages of highlighted banking records, wire transfer receipts, and notarized corporate filings. I reached for my sleek black titanium briefcase, popping the latches open. I grabbed the first stack, Exhibit A. I said out loud to the empty room, my voice echoing off the glass. Falsified power of attorney dated exactly 3 days after my husband died. Signature verified as a complete forgery by 2 independent handwriting experts. The notary stamp belongs to a man who lost his license for fraud 5 years ago. The papers hit the briefcase with a satisfying thud. I grabbed the next stack, tracing the bright yellow highlights. Exhibit B, life insurance payout. $2.5 million deposited into a joint account I supposedly opened with my father Richard. Transfer authorized on May 12th. By May 14th, $2.4 million was wired directly to an LLC, owned exclusively by Barbara and Richard, to purchase the Connecticut estate outright. No mortgage, just stolen cash. I placed those records perfectly aligned next to the forgery documents. Then I picked up the most important file. The masterstroke of their greed. Exhibit C. I whispered, gripping the edges of the heavy corporate portfolio. Intellectual property transfer. Patent number 48291. My husband's predictive trading algorithm. Transferred for the insulting sum of $100 to a holding company controlled by DeAndre. I stared at DeAndre's signature on the documents. 10 years ago, DeAndre was just a mid-level analyst drowning in student debt from his Ivy League education, desperate to impress my sister and my wealth-obsessed parents. He needed a golden ticket. Richard handed him my husband's life work on a silver platter. DeAndre used that stolen technology to launch his flagship hedge fund, generating consistent, impossible returns that made him a Wall Street superstar. He paraded around as a self-made financial genius and investment banker who cracked the code of the market. He was nothing but a thief wearing a custom-tailored suit. I read the final highlighted page of the file. Current valuation of DeAndre's primary fund, $450 million. Initial seed capital directly traced back to the stolen patent. I tossed the entire folder into the briefcase. My parents thought they had executed the perfect crime. They assumed grief had made me weak and stupid. They assumed that because I did not fight them 10 years ago, I simply did not know how. But a forensic accountant knows that money never truly vanishes. It always leaves a trail. Every wire transfer, every offshore shell company, every hidden dividend. I had spent thousands of hours meticulously reconstructing the exact path of every stolen dollar. I mapped their entire financial existence. I snapped the titanium briefcase shut. The sound was sharp, definitive, and final. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the glittering city below. My reflection stared back at me in the glass. The scared, broken 23-year-old widow was completely gone. The woman standing here now was a weapon they forged with their own cruelty. They took my husband's legacy to buy their luxury cars and country club memberships. They laughed in my face and handed my daughter a hollow piece of plastic. They felt untouchable. I walked over to my desk and picked up my phone. I dialed a number I knew by heart, bypassing the receptionist and connecting directly to my contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission, a man who owed me several massive career favors. He answered on the first ring. I took a slow, deep breath. It was finally time. Mitchell. I said, my voice steady and completely stripped of emotion. Check your secure inbox. I just sent over the encrypted file we discussed. I listened to the clicking of his keyboard on the other end of the line. Director Mitchell was a hardened veteran at the Securities and Exchange Commission, a man who had seen every flavor of corporate greed and white-collar crime. But the heavy silence that followed told me the sheer audacity of my parents' crimes had caught even him off guard. "I am looking at it now," Mitchell finally said, his tone shifting into pure professional focus. "Lauren, this is blatant. The falsified notary stamps the wire routing numbers. They funneled an entire life insurance payout through a domestic shell LLC directly into a real estate trust. And this intellectual property transfer, the predictive algorithm patent, they handed it over for $100. They stole it," I corrected him sharply. "They waited until I was heavily medicated for grief, shoved a stack of papers in my face, and told me I was signing hospital release forms. They stole the foundation of DeAndre's entire investment fund, and they used my dead husband's insurance money to buy their luxury estate. I want it all dismantled. I can fast-track the warrants based on this evidence," Mitchell assured me. "We can initiate a full asset freeze pending federal investigation. How fast do you want to move?" I looked at the glowing numbers on my digital clock. It was currently 1 in the morning. I pictured my parents sleeping soundly in their stolen mansion. I pictured DeAndre dreaming about his brand new Porsche. I want everything frozen. By 8:59 a.m. tomorrow, I want every credit card tied to DeAndre and my father to turn into useless plastic. Mitchell did not hesitate. "Consider it done. The banks will receive the federal lock orders before sunrise. Their accounts will be dead before they even finish their morning coffee." I ended the call and immediately dialed my next target. Attorney Harrison was the head of corporate acquisitions at my private equity firm. He was a ruthless operator who specialized in hostile takeovers and stripping corrupt companies down to the studs. I had brought him into my plans 6 months ago, and we had spent half a year quietly maneuvering in the shadows. "Are we ready?" I asked as soon as he answered. "We are locked and loaded," Harrison replied, the excitement evident in his voice. "We have been buying up DeAndre's secondary debt through proxy buyers for months. We secured the final votes from his disgruntled board members this afternoon. DeAndre is so blinded by his own ego that he never bothered to check who was actually acquiring the controlling shares of his parent holding company." "Confirm the timeline," I demanded. "The emergency board meeting is scheduled for 8:30 tomorrow morning," Harrison stated. "We have the absolute majority. By 8:45, you will be the legal owner of his holding company. You will have total operational control over his entire portfolio. Draw up his termination papers," I instructed coldly. "Draft them for gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and corporate fraud. I want him escorted out of his own life. And Harrison, make sure the eviction notice for the Connecticut estate is printed on heavy premium cardstock. I want my father to feel the physical weight of his ruin when I hand it to him." "I will see you in the morning, Lauren." I tossed my phone onto the glass desk. The penthouse was incredibly quiet, holding the heavy silence that only exists right before a devastating storm. I paced the length of my office, the glittering city lights reflecting off the dark hardwood floors. Sleep was an absolute impossibility. Adrenaline surged through my veins, cold, sharp, and precise. I thought about the Easter party. I thought about Barbara handing my 5-year-old daughter an empty plastic egg, mocking her innocence just to score a cruel point against me. I thought about the entire decade of relentless insults, the condescending glances, the family dinners where they treated me like a useless, uneducated burden while eating food bought with my husband's blood money. They felt so incredibly powerful today, utterly convinced of their superiority and untouchable wealth. My anger was no longer hot or chaotic. It had been refined into a surgical weapon. I walked out of my office and headed straight into my massive walk-in closet. Whenever I visited my family, I purposely wore cheap, worn-out cardigans and faded jeans to maintain my cover. They expected a meek, broken woman who would keep her head down and absorb their abuse without a fight. I bypassed the casual wear entirely and reached into the garment bags at the very back of the closet. I pulled out a tailored midnight black power suit cut sharp enough to draw blood. I laid it out perfectly on the dressing island, pairing it with a crisp white silk blouse and a pair of razor-thin black stilettos. This was not just an outfit. This was my armor. This was the uniform of the woman who was about to dismantle their entire fabricated reality. I walked back into my bedroom and paused by my nightstand. Sitting next to the lamp was a silver-framed photograph of my late husband. He was smiling at the camera, looking so vibrant and full of life, completely unaware of the massive betrayal his own in-laws would commit over his freshly dug grave. I picked up the frame, feeling the cool metal against my palms. I gently traced the line of his jaw through the glass. They thought I was stupid, honey. Tomorrow they lose it all. The sun began to rise over the East River, casting long golden shadows across the penthouse. It was 6 in the morning. I moved with absolute mechanical precision. I showered, dressed in the midnight black suit, and pulled my hair back into a severe, flawless twist. I looked in the mirror. There was absolutely no trace of the weeping widow or the submissive, bullied daughter. I gently woke Lily. She rubbed her sleepy eyes, confused about the early hour. I dressed her warmly in her school uniform. By 7:30, I dropped her off at her exclusive private kindergarten in Manhattan, ensuring she was safely tucked away and entirely shielded from the incoming blast radius. I kissed her cheek and promised her an extra-large ice cream after school. I stepped out of the kindergarten building and looked at the street corner. A sleek black luxury SUV was idling at the curb. The rear door swung open. Harrison sat inside, flanked by 2 imposing men in dark suits from our corporate asset recovery team. They looked less like lawyers and more like highly paid executioners. I slid into the back seat. Harrison handed me a fresh black coffee and a heavy leather binder containing the finalized legal documents. "The SEC warrants are officially staged," Harrison said, checking his tablet. "The board vote executes in exactly 40 minutes. "Drive," I told the chauffeur. The SUV pulled away from the curb, merging onto the highway, heading straight toward Connecticut. I watched the digital clock on the dashboard counting down the minutes. 8:00, 8:15. At exactly 8:30, Harrison's phone chimed with a priority alert. He looked at the screen, smiled a razor-sharp smile, and nodded at me. The hostile takeover was fully executed. DeAndre's company was officially mine. At 8:45, we pulled off the highway and entered the winding, manicured roads of my parents' affluent neighborhood. At 8:50, the massive iron gates of their estate came into view. The countdown to 9 in the morning was almost over. The trap had officially sprung. The heavy iron gates of my parents' Connecticut estate did not pose a problem. Harrison had contacted the local sheriff department, presenting the federal warrants and the property seizure notices. A patrol car idled quietly down the street, ready to intervene if things turned violent. The private security guard took one look at the federal badges my recovery team flashed and immediately hit the override button. The massive gates swung open without a single word spoken. The SUV glided up the winding, tree-lined driveway. The mansion loomed ahead. I checked my watch. 8:58 in the morning. Through the bay windows of the dining room, I saw them clearly. The entire family was gathered around a long, custom mahogany table, enjoying a lavish Monday morning brunch. Crystal glasses gleamed under the imported chandelier. Silver platters of catered food covered every available surface. They looked like a magazine advertisement for generational wealth, oblivious to the ticking time bomb rolling up to their steps. From the driveway, I could not hear their exact words initially, but the body language was painfully familiar. I directed the chauffeur to park quietly just out of sight of the windows. My window was rolled down slightly, and their voices drifted through the crisp morning air. DeAndre sat at the head of the table, a position usually reserved for my father. He was leaning back in his chair with a posture of absolute dominance, gesturing expansively with a silver fork. He was actively talking down to my brother Cameron about wealth, his tone dripping with condescension. "You have to understand market liquidity," Cameron DeAndre lectured loudly, taking a sip of his mimosa. "You cannot just leave your capital sitting in standard index funds like an amateur. That is poverty thinking. You need to leverage aggressive debt structures. I made $30 million for my fund before breakfast today. That is how real players operate. You are playing in the minor leagues while I own the entire stadium." Cameron sat hunched forward, nodding enthusiastically like a desperate subordinate begging for scraps. "Yes, absolutely, DeAndre. I was actually hoping you could look over my portfolio later. I would really value your insight. Allison Cameron's wife was actively pouring more coffee for Brittany, playing the role of the subservient sister-in-law perfectly. Richard and Barbara sat on the opposite side, beaming at DeAndre with unrestrained pride. They were worshipping the very man who had stolen my husband's legacy, treating him like a financial god, simply because he was extraordinarily rich. The SUV crept forward, stopping in front of the grand oak double doors. I did not wait for the chauffeur to open my door. I pushed it open myself, stepping out onto the pristine cobblestone driveway. The crisp morning air felt electric against my skin. Harrison and the two recovery specialists flanked me, moving with military precision. I checked my watch one last time. 8:59 and 50 seconds. We walked up the wide stone steps. I did not bother to knock. I did not ring the bell. At exactly 9 in the morning, I grabbed the brass handles and pushed the heavy doors wide open. The heavy thud of the doors hitting the interior walls echoed like a gunshot through the quiet, luxurious mansion. The laughter in the dining room stopped instantly. 5 heads snapped toward the foyer. For a split second, none of them recognized the woman standing in their entryway. They were expecting the defeated, exhausted widow who wore oversized sweaters and kept her head bowed in shame. They were not expecting a woman in a razor-sharp black power suit flanked by 3 towering men in dark suits radiating pure, unadulterated menace. Brittany dropped her silver fork onto her porcelain plate with a loud clatter. DeAndre froze, his arrogant smile melting into an expression of sheer confusion. Lauren Richard bellowed, his face instantly turning a mottled shade of angry red. He slammed his hands flat against the mahogany table and shoved his chair back violently. He stood up, throwing his linen napkin onto his half-eaten breakfast. "What in the world do you think you are doing? How did you get past the security gate? Who are these people?" I did not answer him immediately. I walked slowly and deliberately into the dining room, my stilettos clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble floor. The sound was deafening in the dead silence of the room. Harrison and the 2 recovery agents followed closely behind me, fanning out slightly to secure the space. Their sheer physical presence sucked all the air out of the room. "You are trespassing!" Barbara shrieked, clutching the collar of her silk morning robe as she stared in horror. She looked frantically from me to the imposing men in suits. "Richard, call the police right now. She has completely lost her mind. She brought thugs into our home." "Call them," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. "Please call the police, Barbara. In fact, there is a patrol car waiting at the bottom of the hill. I am sure they would love to come up here and assist with the eviction process." Cameron stood up next, trying to puff out his chest and play the protective son. "You need to leave right now, Lauren. You cannot just barge in here and disrupt our morning because you are having another one of your mental breakdowns. You are embarrassing yourself and scaring Mom." I stopped at the head of the dining table. I placed my titanium briefcase flat onto the table, right on top of their expensive catered pastries, crushing them completely. I popped the latches. The sharp metallic click made Allison jump in her seat. I pulled out the thick stack of legal documents, the exact papers I had meticulously organized the night before. I held them up so they could all see the heavy federal seals stamped on the front pages. "I am not having a breakdown, Cameron," I said, holding his gaze until he nervously looked away. "I am executing a federal seizure." I slammed the heavy stack of papers onto the mahogany table. The sound cracked through the room like thunder. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, and looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. "This house was bought with stolen life insurance money. Here is the foreclosure notice. You have 48 hours to pack your things." The silence in the dining room was absolute. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the sharp intake of breath from my sister Brittany. Richard stared at the federal foreclosure notice, his eyes wide, his jaw slack. He looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. Barbara gripped the edges of her silk robe so tightly, her knuckles turned bone white. She could not comprehend the reality sitting right in front of her. To her, I was still the broken, grieving 23-year-old she had manipulated 10 years ago. Then the spell broke. DeAndre let out a loud, booming laugh. It was a rich, deeply arrogant sound that echoed through the high ceilings of the dining room. He tossed his linen napkin onto his plate, pushed his heavy dining chair back, and stood up. At 6'3", DeAndre was an imposing figure. He had built his entire persona on projecting power, using his Ivy League pedigree and his aggressive Wall Street demeanor to force people into submission. He buttoned his custom-tailored suit jacket, walked slowly around the edge of the mahogany table, and stopped just inches from where I stood. He tried to use his height to tower over me, looking down his nose with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. He shook his head, flashing a brilliant, condescending smile. "Are you insane?" DeAndre asked, his voice dripping with venomous amusement. "You march into this house with some rented thugs and a stack of fake papers throwing around legal terms you probably Googled last night. You are a college dropout, Lauren. You serve coffee or whatever it is you do. My investment fund is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I am a titan in this industry. If you do not turn around and walk out that door right now, I will bury you in legal fees so deep you will be paying my attorneys for the rest of your miserable life." He took another step forward, encroaching on my personal space, expecting me to cower. He expected the fragile widow who had surrendered everything 10 years ago. He wanted me to break under the sheer weight of his fabricated authority. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked him dead in the eyes, my expression absolute ice. "Your fund was built on my late husband's stolen software patent," I said, my voice cutting through his arrogance like a razor blade. DeAndre's smile completely vanished. His eyes darted to the side for a fraction of a second, the very first crack in his impenetrable armor. Brittany gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her hand. Richard suddenly looked as if he was going to be physically ill. The color drained entirely from his face as he realized I knew exactly what he had done in those dark days following the funeral. "You thought you were a genius." DeAndre, I continued, taking a deliberate step toward him, now forcing him to hold his ground. "You parade around financial networks claiming you designed a revolutionary predictive algorithm that changed the market. You did not design anything. 10 years ago, my father handed you my dead husband's intellectual property for a single $100 bill. You took a grieving woman's signature on a forged power of attorney, stripped her husband's life work, and used it to launch your flagship hedge fund. You are not a titan. You are a parasite who got rich feeding off a corpse." DeAndre's chest heaved. He pointed a finger angrily at my face, dropping his polished executive persona entirely. "You cannot prove any of that. That intellectual property transfer was completely legal, signed, and authorized. You have absolutely nothing but wild accusations." I tapped the titanium briefcase resting on the table. "I have an independent audit tracing the foundational code of your primary trading software directly back to my husband's original patent filings. I have the sworn deposition of the disgraced notary who stamped those fraudulent transfer documents. I have everything, DeAndre. But honestly, the federal investigation into your initial seed capital is just the cherry on top." I tilted my head, studying the sweat beginning to form on his forehead. I wanted to drag out this exact second. I wanted him to feel the ground completely drop out from underneath his expensive Italian leather shoes. And guess who is the lead legal representative for the holding company that initiated a hostile takeover of 51% of your firm this morning at 8:30 a.m.? I asked, letting the question hang in the air for exactly 2 seconds. "Me. You are fired, DeAndre." The air was sucked entirely out of the room. DeAndre stared at me, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly like a suffocating fish. "That is impossible," he stammered, his voice suddenly lacking all of its previous boom and bravado. "My board would never approve a sale without my authorization. I hold the majority voting rights." "Harrison." My acquisition specialist stepped forward from his position by the door. He pulled a sleek tablet from his jacket pocket and tapped the screen. "Actually, Mr. Davis, you held the majority rights until you recklessly leveraged your own shares against a series of high-risk domestic developments last quarter. You were so busy acting like a kingmaker that you failed to notice a private equity syndicate systematically buying up every single piece of your secondary debt over the past 6 months. We called the debt in this morning. Your board held an emergency proxy vote to liquidate your controlling shares to avoid total bankruptcy. The vote passed unanimously. DeAndre stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of his dining chair. He yanked his phone from his pocket, his fingers shaking uncontrollably as he tapped the screen frantically. Your corporate email has been deactivated, I informed him coldly. Your access badges to the downtown high-rise have been voided. Security is currently clearing out your corner office. As of 8:45 this morning, you do not own a fund. You do not have a job. You do not even own the proprietary software you claim to have invented. Brittany lunged forward, grabbing DeAndre's arm. DeAndre, tell me she is lying. Tell her she cannot do this. We have the Hamptons house closing next week. You promised me. DeAndre ignored her. He was staring at his phone screen, his eyes wide with absolute terror. I watched the realization crash over him, watched the exact moment his ego shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The arrogant investment banker who had just been lecturing my brother about minor leagues and stadiums was now visibly hyperventilating in his father-in-law's dining room. Cameron and Allison stood frozen against the far wall, completely speechless. They had spent the entire morning kissing the ring of a man they thought was invincible, only to watch him get financially executed in under 3 minutes by the sister they had relentlessly mocked. I turned my attention away from DeAndre's panic attack and looked back at my father. Richard was gripping the edge of the dining table, his knuckles white, staring at the foreclosure notice as if it were a venomous snake. "We are not done," I told him, my voice ringing clearly through the chaos of the room. "You took my husband's life insurance. You took his patent. You took my daughter's future. And now I am taking everything." "You are taking nothing from us!" Brittany shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical frequency that grated against the high ceilings. She shoved past DeAndre, marching right up to the edge of the mahogany table. Her hands were shaking with absolute rage. She reached into her designer handbag and ripped out her heavy metal black American Express card, slamming it down next to the foreclosure notice. "Do you know what this is, Lauren? This is unlimited capital. This is power you cannot even begin to comprehend. I am going to call the most vicious defense attorneys in Manhattan. I am going to hire a legal team so ruthless they will rip your pathetic little life apart. We will sue you for defamation, for corporate espionage, for trespassing. By the time we are done with you, you will be begging to go back to scrubbing floors." Brittany stood there, her chest heaving, waiting for me to flinch at the sight of her elite status symbol. She believed that because she had spent the last decade swiping that card for luxury vacations, private jets, and designer wardrobes, it made her invincible. I looked at the black card resting on the polished wood. Then I looked at the diamond-encrusted watch on her wrist. 10 seconds passed. The silence in the room stretched taut, thick with unresolved tension. Then the digital execution began. It started with a sharp, piercing ping from Brittany's purse. Before she could reach for her phone, it pinged again, then a third time, rapidly escalating into a frantic barrage of notification chimes. The continuous sound cut through the dining room, sharp and alarming. Brittany scrambled to pull her phone out, her manicured nails fumbling with the screen. "What is this?" she muttered, swiping furiously. "Why is my digital wallet sending me decline notices? I am not even buying anything right now." Suddenly, DeAndre's phone erupted. The harsh vibration buzzed aggressively against the fabric of his tailored suit pocket. He yanked it out, staring at the caller ID with wide, terrified eyes. He answered it, not bothering to step out of the room. "Davis." He barked into the receiver, his voice tight with panic. "What do you mean my portfolio is frozen? Who authorized a lock on my personal accounts?" "No, you listen to me. I am a Tier 1 client. You do not freeze my assets without my direct authorization." While DeAndre screamed at his wealth manager, Richard's cell phone began to ring. The shrill traditional ringtone echoed off the marble floors. My father stared at his phone resting on the dining table as if it were a live grenade. The caller ID flashed the name of his primary banking institution. He picked it up with a trembling hand, pressing the speakerphone button by accident in his sheer panic. "Mr. Williams," a polite but incredibly tense voice announced through the speaker. "This is the Fraud Prevention Department. We are calling to inform you that a hard freeze has been placed on all your checking, savings, and offshore routing accounts. This is a mandatory federal hold. Richard stood paralyzed. What federal hold? He demanded, his voice cracking. I have over $4 million in liquid cash across those accounts. You cannot just freeze them. The voice on the speaker remained professionally detached. We received a direct mandate from the Securities and Exchange Commission at 8:59 this morning, sir. We are legally prohibited from authorizing any withdrawals, transfers, or liquidations. Have a good day. The line went dead. The dial tone echoed in the silent room. Brittany was now frantically tapping her phone screen, her face flushed red with frantic desperation. This is a mistake, she yelled, looking at DeAndre and Richard. This is just a banking glitch. Lauren is playing some sort of sick prank. I will fix this right now. She tapped her screen and engaged the speakerphone, slamming the device onto the table next to her useless black card. The line rang twice before an elite concierge operator answered. Centurion Services, this is Preston. How may I assist you today? Mrs. Davis, Preston? Brittany barked, her voice dripping with entitlement. My digital wallet is throwing errors and my husband is having issues with his bank. I need you to bypass whatever security hold is currently active on my account immediately. I also need you to retain the services of the Vanguard Legal Group in Manhattan. Put their retainer fee directly on my card. There was a long, excruciating pause on the other end of the line. When the operator spoke again, the deferential customer service tone was completely gone. Mrs. Davis, I cannot assist you with that request, he stated clearly. Excuse me, Brittany demanded, her voice rising to a shriek. I spend $500,000 a year on this card. You will do exactly what I tell you to do, or I will have your job by the end of the day. Mrs. Davis, the operator replied, his voice dropping to a flat, serious register. As of 3 minutes ago, your account was flagged and permanently suspended under a Priority 1 federal lockdown. We have received an injunction from the United States Treasury and the Securities and Exchange Commission. All credit lines tied to your Social Security number, your husband's Social Security number, and your related business entities have been locked under suspicion of federal money laundering and corporate fraud. Brittany stopped breathing. The entire family stood frozen in place. The operator continued, delivering the final devastating blow. We are legally required to inform you that attempting to access these funds or bypass this freeze is a federal offense. Your card is no longer valid. Please do not call this line again. The call disconnected. The screen went black. The color drained entirely from Brittany's face. The haughty, untouchable woman who had mocked my daughter just 30 minutes ago was completely gone. She looked down at her black American Express card, the symbol of her entire identity, realizing it was now nothing more than a worthless piece of metal. DeAndre dropped his phone. It hit the marble floor, the screen cracking instantly. He did not even try to pick it up. He just stared at me, his chest heaving, the reality of his total financial execution finally sinking in. Cameron and Allison stood pressed against the far wall, their faces pale masks of pure terror. They had built their own comfortable lives by leeching off Richard and DeAndre's wealth, expecting an endless flow of family capital. Now they were watching their primary financial lifelines get completely severed. Cameron looked at his own phone, terrified to even check his balance. Richard sank back into his dining chair. He looked at his hands, his fingers trembling violently. The power dynamic in the room had fundamentally shifted. They were no longer the wealthy elite looking down on a pathetic failure. They were cornered criminals, stripped of every resource they had ever used to control the people around them. I stood at the head of the table, perfectly calm, watching their world burn to ash. You wanted to hire the best defense attorneys in New York, Brittany? I asked, my voice slicing through their collective shock. You wanted to rip my life apart. Go ahead. Make the call. Oh, wait. You cannot. Because attorneys require a retainer, and you do not have a single cent to your name. Barbara finally found her voice, a weak, trembling whisper. Lauren, please. Our grocery money. Our gas money. Everything is in those accounts. We cannot even buy food. I looked at my mother, feeling absolutely zero pity. I remembered the nights I sat in my freezing apartment choosing between keeping the heat on or buying medicine for Lily, while they threw lavish parties using my dead husband's money. I remembered the devastating smirk on her face when she handed my innocent 5-year-old an empty plastic egg just to prove a cruel point. She wanted me to feel utterly powerless. Now she was going to experience exactly what that felt like. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table next to the foreclosure notice. "You have 48 hours to pack your things," I repeated coldly. "I suggest you start finding boxes instead of begging for cash. The clock is ticking." I stepped back from the mahogany table, leaving the federal foreclosure notice resting exactly where it was. Without waiting for a response from my mother, I turned on my stiletto heels and walked out of the dining room. I crossed the grand hallway and entered their opulent living room. A polished silver coffee service sat untouched on the sideboard prepared earlier by their catering staff. I picked up a delicate porcelain cup, poured myself a fresh serving of black coffee, and took a seat in my father's favorite leather wingback chair. I crossed my legs, smoothed my suit jacket, and waited. Back in the dining room, the initial paralysis finally broke. Pure survival instinct kicked in, transforming their shock into explosive, frantic energy. I could hear the aggressive shuffling of chairs and the heavy thud of fast footsteps. DeAndre and Richard burst into the living room, operating on sheer desperate adrenaline. They completely ignored me sitting in the corner. Instead of accepting defeat, they instantly reverted to the only defensive strategy they knew: gaslighting, manipulation, and leveraging their elite social network to crush their enemies. DeAndre grabbed the heavy brass landline phone from the study desk, abandoning his cracked cell phone on the floor. Richard had his own cell phone pressed tight against his ear, pacing the expensive Persian rug like a caged animal. "The smear campaign began immediately," Gordon Richard said, forcing his voice into a sickeningly perfect tone of distressed paternal concern. "I need an enormous favor. It is Lauren. Yes, my troubled daughter. She is having a complete psychotic break. We tried to get her psychiatric help for years, but she refused. Now she has hired armed thugs to hack into our banking portal and lock us out of our accounts. She is trying to extort her own family for millions of dollars. I need you to call the precinct captain. We need her forcibly removed and committed to a facility, and I need an emergency injunction to override a fraudulent bank hold." I took a slow sip of my coffee. The roast was excellent, rich, and dark. I watched my father spin his web of lies without a single ounce of hesitation. He honestly believed that if he painted me as a mentally unstable, hysterical woman, his wealthy country club friends would simply wave their hands and make the federal authorities disappear. He was using my past vulnerability, the deep depression I suffered after my husband died, as a weapon to discredit my current power. Across the room, DeAndre was barking orders into the landline. "Listen to me, David." DeAndre hissed, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "Do not listen to the proxy voters. Do not sign anything. We have a rogue actor inside the network. My crazy sister-in-law is pulling a massive cyber attack on the firm. She fabricated a bunch of intellectual property disputes to trigger an automatic hold. It is corporate espionage. I am still the majority shareholder. I am still in charge." DeAndre paused, his face dropping as the person on the other end of the line clearly gave him bad news. DeAndre's grip on the phone tightened so hard, his knuckles turned white. "What do you mean the board already ratified the sale? David, you work for me. You fix this right now, or I will end your career." DeAndre slammed the receiver down, cursing loudly. His polished Ivy League demeanor was completely gone. He was no longer a sophisticated investment banker. He was a desperate fraud, realizing the walls were closing in. Cameron walked into the living room looking like a terrified child. He watched our father beg for short-term bridge loans over the phone. The realization that the endless well of family cash was completely dry finally hit him. Allison hovered in the doorway behind him, sobbing quietly into her hands, suddenly realizing her luxury lifestyle had evaporated into thin air. Brittany was pacing near the hallway, frantically demanding that Barbara pack all the expensive jewelry into a tote bag before the bank could seize it. I sat there in total silence, observing them self-destruct. It was a fascinating psychological study, When you strip away the money from people who use wealth as a substitute for personality, there is absolutely nothing left but cowardice and panic. They were turning on everyone, lying to their closest allies, digging their graves deeper with every single phone call. Richard dialed another number, his voice growing higher and more frantic. "Listen, Senator, I am dealing with an extortion plot. My daughter has lost her mind. She is violent. She brought mercenaries into my home. I need your influence to freeze an SEC investigation. It is a witch hunt based on forged documents." DeAndre picked the landline back up, his hands shaking violently. He punched in an international dialing code. I recognized the sequence instantly. It was the country code for the Cayman Islands. "Listen to me very carefully," DeAndre ordered the offshore wealth manager. "The domestic accounts are compromised. We have a total federal lockdown on the primary funds. I need you to activate the Cayman contingency protocols right now. Liquidate the reserve assets in the shadow accounts and route them through the secondary shell corporation immediately. I do not care about the early withdrawal penalty fees. Move the money now. Use the encrypted routing protocol and send the cash to the untraceable ledger." I rested my porcelain coffee cup on my knee. My phone vibrated intensely inside my suit jacket pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a secure text message from my asset recovery team, who were currently monitoring the financial surveillance net we had placed over DeAndre's entire digital footprint. The text message was brief and perfect. "They are trying to move offshore funds. Cayman accounts activated. International wire transfers initiated." A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. This was the exact trap I had set. Freezing their domestic accounts was just the bait. I needed them to panic. I needed them to feel so cornered and desperate that they would attempt to access their hidden untaxed offshore accounts to save themselves. By initiating those massive transfers across international lines while under an active federal SEC freeze, DeAndre and Richard had just made a fatal mistake. They had just upgraded their crimes from civil financial fraud to federal wire fraud and international money laundering. They had just handed the federal prosecutors the exact smoking gun required to guarantee actual lengthy prison sentences. It was exactly what I wanted them to do. While DeAndre and my father continued to incriminate themselves on international phone lines, Cameron finally decided it was his moment to shine. He had spent his entire life playing second fiddle to DeAndre, desperate for a fraction of the respect my parents showered on my brother-in-law. Cameron saw an opportunity to be the hero to save the family empire and secure his place as the loyal, protective son. He backed away from the dining room archway and slipped into the grand foyer. He pulled out his cell phone, his hands trembling as he dialed 911. I could hear his voice echoing off the marble walls, perfectly modulating his tone to sound breathless and terrified. "Yes, please send officers immediately," Cameron pleaded into the receiver. "We have a domestic disturbance. My sister has forced her way into my parents' home. She is severely mentally ill and has a history of violent outbursts. She brought 3 unidentified men with her, and they are threatening my elderly parents. We need immediate assistance. Please hurry." He hung up the phone and shot me a triumphant, venomous glare from the hallway. He honestly believed he had just checkmated me. He thought the local police would rush in, tackle me to the floor, and drag me out in handcuffs, neatly solving their entire financial apocalypse. I did not move a single muscle. I remained seated in the leather wingback chair, my posture relaxed, holding my porcelain coffee cup. Harrison and the 2 recovery agents stood completely still, their expressions utterly bored. They had executed dozens of federal seizures. A call to the local police was standard operating procedure for cornered, desperate executives trying to exert whatever pathetic amount of control they had left. Within 10 minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the quiet Connecticut morning. The sound grew rapidly louder, echoing through the manicured hills of the affluent neighborhood. Red and blue lights flashed aggressively through the massive bay windows, casting frantic shadows across the living room walls. Tires screeched on the cobblestone driveway as 2 local patrol cars slammed to a halt right behind my team's SUV. Cameron sprinted to the front doors, throwing them open before the officers could even ring the bell. He played the part of the panicked victim, flawlessly waving his arms and pointing frantically toward the living room. Thank God you are here, Cameron gasped, his voice shaking with manufactured fear. She is in there. She is completely out of control. We asked her to leave, but she brought these giant men to intimidate us. My parents are terrified. Two police officers marched into the grand foyer, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They were young, tense, and clearly primed for a dangerous confrontation with a highly unstable intruder. They stepped quickly into the living room, their eyes scanning the space, assessing the threat level. The moment the officers crossed the threshold, Barbara initiated the performance of a lifetime. The transformation was genuinely staggering. The vicious, screaming woman who had just been demanding her jewelry be hidden instantly vanished. In her place stood a frail, terrified elderly mother. Barbara clutched the collar of her silk robe with trembling hands. She let out a loud, shuddering sob, forcing tears to well up in her eyes and spill over her meticulously powdered cheeks. She swayed slightly, leaning heavily against Richard as if her legs could no longer support her own weight. "Officer, my daughter is having a psychotic break!" Barbara cried, her voice cracking with perfect theatrical fragility. "She is threatening our family. She broke in here demanding money, screaming that she is going to take our house. She is not well. She has been sick for a very long time and we are so frightened. Please, you have to get her out of here before someone gets hurt." Richard wrapped a protective arm around Barbara's shoulders, glaring at me with righteous, fabricated anger. "We tried to get her psychiatric help years ago," Officer Richard added, shaking his head sorrowfully. "But she refused. She dropped out of college, cut all ties with us, and now she shows up a decade later with hired muscle to extort us." Brittany chimed in, wiping away a fake tear of her own. "She is completely delusional. She keeps babbling about stolen patents and federal investigations. It is complete nonsense. We just want her to leave peacefully so we can get her the medical help she desperately needs." The lead officer, a tall man with a stern jaw, stepped forward. He looked from the weeping Barbara to the intimidating presence of Harrison and the recovery agents, and finally down at me. I was sitting perfectly still, my legs elegantly crossed, wearing a custom midnight black suit that cost more than his annual salary. The absolute lack of hysteria on my end clearly confused him, but the family's performance was incredibly convincing. "Ma'am," the officer said, his tone commanding and authoritative. "I need you to stand up slowly, place your hands where I can see them, and step away from the chair. And you three men back up to the wall immediately." Harrison did not flinch. He reached slowly inside his tailored jacket. The second officer instantly unclipped his radio, his posture shifting into aggressive readiness. "Keep your hands visible," the officer barked. Harrison smoothly pulled out a sleek leather wallet and flipped it open, displaying his credentials. "We are Corporate Legal Counsel Officer," Harrison stated, his voice carrying the icy authority of a man who owned the room. "We are here acting on federal authority." Cameron laughed loudly, a sharp barking sound meant to dismiss Harrison entirely. "Do not listen to him. They are hired thugs. My sister is a desperate broke dropout who is trying to scam us. Arrest her right now for trespassing. She is terrifying my mother." The lead officer kept his focus locked on me. "Ma'am, this is private property. The homeowners have asked you to leave. If you do not comply immediately, I will be forced to place you under arrest for criminal trespassing and harassment. Stand up." My family watched with bated breath. The smug satisfaction returning to their faces was undeniable. Barbara peeked out from behind Richard's shoulder, a tiny venomous smirk breaking through her fake tears. She truly thought she had won. She believed the police would drag me out in handcuffs, utterly humiliating me while restoring her total control over the narrative. DeAndre even crossed his arms, nodding approvingly at the officers, as if he were their commanding officer. I took one final deliberate sip of my coffee. I placed the delicate porcelain cup gently onto the silver saucer resting on the side table. The soft clink of the china seemed incredibly loud in the tense, silent room. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket. I did not raise my hands. I did not show an ounce of fear. I looked directly at the lead officer with an expression of absolute unyielding corporate dominance. "Officer," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the heavy air, "I completely understand why you were dispatched here today. My brother gave you a very compelling, highly emotional narrative over the phone. However, you are operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of who actually holds the legal authority in this residence. The officer frowned, taking a half step forward. Ma'am, I am not going to ask you again. I am not trespassing, I stated flatly, holding his gaze without a single tremor of hesitation. I stepped toward the mahogany dining table, picked up the thick stack of documents with the federal seals, and held them out. You are standing in the middle of an active federal asset seizure. I am the legal representative of the holding trust that currently owns this property. The people crying and screaming behind you are not the victims. They are the targets of a massive federal fraud investigation. I turned my head, slightly locking eyes with Cameron, whose triumphant smile instantly began to falter. And since you decided to involve law enforcement this morning, Cameron, I added, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. Let us discuss exactly why you were so eager to get the police inside this house. The lead officer frowned, clearly torn between the hysterical performance of my mother and the absolute terrifying calm of my team. Ma'am, the officer said, his hand still resting on his duty belt. I do not care who you claim to be or what papers you are holding. You need to step outside right now so we can sort this out on the lawn. If you refuse, I will put you in handcuffs. I did not step outside. I did not move toward the door. Instead, I gave Harrison a sharp nod. Harrison smoothly unzipped the interior compartment of his leather portfolio. He did not pull out a business card or a civil lawsuit. He pulled out a thick, blue bonded document bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. He stepped past me and handed it directly to the lead officer. Read the second page, Officer Harrison instructed coldly. Read the names listed under the active federal indictment, and then look at the signature of the federal judge at the bottom. The officer took the document, his annoyance visibly shifting into confusion. He flipped to the second page. His eyes scanned the text. I watched his entire posture change in a matter of seconds. The aggressive, commanding stance of a local cop ready to make an arrest completely vanished. His hand dropped away from his duty belt. He looked up, his eyes wide, staring at Cameron, then at DeAndre, and finally back at me. This is a federal search and seizure warrant, the officer stated, his voice completely stripped of its previous authority. Issued by the Southern District of New York. Exactly, I replied, my voice slicing through the deadly silence of the living room. I turned my full attention to Cameron. My older brother was standing by the archway, his smug, heroic smile slowly sliding off his face. The color was draining from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He had called the police, hoping to watch me get dragged out in humiliation. He had no idea he had just locked himself inside a federal cage. You always were the stupidest person in the room, Cameron, I said, taking slow, deliberate steps toward him. You honestly thought I came here today without planning for every single variable. You thought I would just barge in here and let you call the local police to bail you out. I wanted you to call them. I needed local law enforcement present on the premises to officially execute the detention protocol. You did exactly what I predicted you would do. You delivered yourself right into the trap. Cameron swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. I do not know what you are talking about. You are crazy. Officer, arrest her. She is making things up. She is just a jealous college dropout. I laughed. A cold, sharp sound that echoed off the marble walls. I am not making up the fictitious shell companies you registered in Delaware, Cameron. I am not making up the inflated invoices your luxury real estate firm billed to DeAndre's investment fund for properties that absolutely do not exist. Cameron took a sudden step backward, bumping into a heavy antique vase on a pedestal. It wobbled precariously. His chest began to heave. Did you really think nobody would ever notice the pattern? I asked, my voice rising in volume and authority, pinning him to the wall. DeAndre needed a way to clean the dirty money he was siphoning from the stolen patent revenues. He needed a washing machine. And you, Cameron, with your failing luxury real estate firm and your desperate need for Dad's approval, were the perfect idiot for the job. You routed millions of dollars through fake property renovations, skimming your little percentage off the top to pay for your country club memberships and Allison's sports cars. You committed federal wire fraud on a monthly basis. That is a lie, Cameron shouted, his voice cracking into a high hysterical pitch. It was consulting work. DeAndre hired me for market analysis. It was completely legal. DeAndre squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a groan of pure despair. Cameron had just admitted to a financial relationship with the fund on a recorded line in front of 2 police officers. The sheer incompetence of my brother was breathtaking. He was supposed to be the brilliant heir to the family legacy, but he could not even keep his mouth shut when cornered by the truth. The lead officer pulled his radio from his shoulder. "Dispatch, we have a situation at the Williams residence. I need you to contact the regional FBI field office and confirm an active warrant for a Cameron Williams and a DeAndre Davis." "Yes, I will hold." The officer clipped the radio back to his uniform and looked directly at my brother. "Mr. Williams, you need to step away from the doorway and keep your hands where I can see them. You are officially detained pending federal confirmation. Do not make any sudden movements." Cameron's knees buckled. He slid down the wall, collapsing onto the hardwood floor in a pathetic crumpled heap. He grabbed his hair, pulling at the roots, hyperventilating so hard I could hear his breath wheezing in his chest. "I am not going to jail," he gasped over and over again. "I cannot go to jail. DeAndre told me it was safe. He said it was a tax loophole." Allison, who had been hiding in the shadow of the archway, suddenly realized the absolute magnitude of the situation. Her luxury life, her designer bags, her children's private schools, everything was built on a federal crime that had just been exposed in her own living room. The perfect superior facade she had maintained for years was evaporating in front of her eyes. She let out a blood-curdling scream. It was not a cry of sorrow. It was a shriek of pure selfish terror. She threw herself onto the floor next to Cameron, hitting his shoulder with her fists. "What did you do?" she wailed, her pristine makeup instantly running down her face in dark streaks. "You promised me we were rich. You promised me the money was clean. We are going to lose the house, Cameron. They are going to take my kids away." Allison scrambled up from the floor, her eyes wild. She looked across the room and sprinted toward my father. She grabbed Richard by the lapels of his expensive morning jacket, shaking him violently. "Richard, do something," Allison screamed right into his face, her voice tearing through the room. "You are the patriarch. Fix this. Call your lawyers. Call the mayor. Tell the police Lauren is lying. Make them stop. Do not let them take my husband away." Richard did not move. He did not raise his hands to comfort her. He did not yell at the police officers. The man who had ruled our family with an iron fist, the man who had controlled every narrative, every bank account, and every decision for 30 years, was completely paralyzed. He stared blankly ahead, his eyes glazed over, staring at a spot on the wall just past my shoulder. He was broken. The illusion of his power had been permanently shattered. He finally understood that there was no phone call he could make, no check he could write, and no lie he could spin that would save him from the federal government. He had handed his empire to a fraud and built his castle on stolen ground, and now the earth was opening up to swallow him whole. Richard Allison sobbed, shaking him harder. "Say something." My father slowly lowered his head, staring at the floor, and remained completely silent. His inability to act was the final nail in the coffin for their delusions. I stood in the center of the wreckage, watching the family that had discarded me tear themselves to shreds. Cameron was weeping on the floor. Allison was screaming at a paralyzed statue. DeAndre was staring at his broken phone, and my mother was clutching the wall as if the room were spinning. The trap had closed perfectly. Every single mechanism I had engineered over the last 3 years had functioned flawlessly. They thought they could bury my husband's secret and walk away into a life of luxury. Instead, they had dug their own graves, and I had simply handed them the shovels. While the living room descended into absolute chaos, my mother Barbara stood perfectly still against the imported wallpaper. She watched her golden son Cameron weeping on the floor. She watched her brilliant son-in-law DeAndre staring blankly at a shattered cell phone. She watched her powerful husband completely shut down. The untouchable fortress of wealth she had spent a decade enjoying was actively burning to the ground right in front of her eyes. But Barbara was not paralyzed by fear like Richard. Barbara was a survivor of the most vicious kind. She was a master manipulator who always looked for a back door when the main gates were breached. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on me. She saw the icy determination in my posture and realized immediately that crying or begging would not work. Financial threats were entirely useless. I held all the cards, but in her twisted, desperate mind, she believed she still knew my one fatal weakness. She remembered the little girl holding an empty plastic egg just a few hours ago, Lily. I was completely focused on Harrison and the lead police officer, ensuring Cameron was properly detained under the federal warrant. I did not notice Barbara slowly backing away from the archway. She slipped her silk robe off her shoulders, abandoning it on a hallway chair, revealing her expensive cashmere sweater underneath. She moved silently through the massive gourmet kitchen, avoiding the catering staff who were nervously watching the police lights outside. She grabbed her car keys from the marble island, opened the heavy oak side door, and slipped out into the cool morning air. Barbara climbed into her pristine white SUV parked near the garage. Her hands shook as she gripped the leather steering wheel. She started the engine, kept the headlights off, and reversed quietly down the service driveway, bypassing the police cars blocking the main entrance. Once she hit the main road, she slammed her foot on the gas pedal. She was heading straight for Manhattan. She was heading for Lily. During the intense hour-long drive into the city, Barbara's mind raced, spinning a completely fabricated justification for what she was about to do. In her distorted reality, she was not committing a crime. She was not planning a kidnapping. She was simply stepping in as the loving matriarch to save her family from a hysterical, ungrateful daughter. She convinced herself that if she could just get physical custody of Lily, the entire power dynamic would instantly shift. I would have to drop the federal charges. I would have to release the frozen funds. I would have to negotiate, because what kind of mother would risk her child's safety for money? Barbara smiled grimly at the windshield. She thought she had found the perfect leverage. She navigated the busy Manhattan streets, pulling up to the curb outside the exclusive private kindergarten in Tribeca. The building was heavily secured, boasting thick glass doors and a pristine brick facade. It catered to the children of diplomats, celebrities, and top-tier corporate executives. Barbara parked illegally in a loading zone, not caring about the risk of a ticket. She grabbed her designer handbag, checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, and pasted on a warm, affectionate smile. She transformed herself back into the wealthy, doting grandmother she pretended to be at country club luncheons. She walked up to the heavy glass doors and pressed the intercom button. A buzzer sounded, and she pulled the door open, stepping into the quiet, brightly lit reception area. The lobby smelled of expensive cleaning supplies and fresh flowers. Behind a sleek, curved wooden desk sat the school receptionist, a stern woman named Brenda, who was currently typing on a computer. "Good morning," Barbara said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I am here for a slightly early pickup. I need to collect my granddaughter Lily. We have a sudden family emergency and her mother asked me to rush over and get her." Brenda stopped typing and looked up. She adjusted her glasses, her expression remaining entirely professional and thoroughly unimpressed by Barbara's designer clothes. "Good morning, ma'am. I can certainly help you with that. May I please have your photo identification?" Barbara scoffed softly, digging into her purse. "Of course. You people are always so wonderfully careful. I am Barbara Lily's grandmother. My daughter Lauren sent me. I am sure you have seen me at the holiday recitals." She slid her driver's license across the smooth wooden counter. Brenda took the license, examining it closely, before turning to her computer monitor. She clicked the mouse a few times, navigating through the school's strict security database. The silence in the lobby stretched for a few seconds. Barbara tapped her manicured fingernails impatiently against the desk. "I am very sorry, Mrs. Williams," Brenda said, sliding the license back across the counter. "But you are not listed on the approved pickup authorization form for Lily. I cannot release the child to you." Barbara's pleasant smile faltered slightly, but she quickly forced it back into place. "Oh, there must be some sort of clerical error. Lauren has been terribly busy lately with her job. She must have forgotten to update the paperwork. But I assure you it is perfectly fine. I am her maternal grandmother. Just go ahead and bring Lily out here. We have a flight to catch for a family funeral, and we are running terribly late." "I apologize for your family emergency," Brenda replied, her tone absolutely unwavering. But our security protocols are very strict. Unless an individual is explicitly named on the primary contact list by the custodial parent, we cannot allow the student to leave the premises. I can attempt to call Lily's mother right now to get verbal authorization if you would like. No, Barbara snapped sharply, her voice losing its sweet, melodious quality. The sudden shift in tone made Brenda sit up straighter. Lauren is currently dealing with the crisis. Barbara hastily covered up her outburst, forcing a tight, highly unconvincing smile. She is completely unreachable at the moment. Her phone is off. That is exactly why she sent me. Now I understand you are just doing your job, but I am telling you to bring my granddaughter out to this lobby right now. I do not have time for bureaucratic nonsense. Ma'am, I am going to ask you to lower your voice, Brenda instructed firmly, her hand inching toward the landline phone on her desk. I cannot and will not release the child to an unauthorized individual. Those are the rules. If you continue to raise your voice, I will have to call school security. Barbara slammed her hand down onto the wooden counter. Her eyes were wild, darting around the empty lobby as pure desperation flooded her veins. Her entire family was currently being dismantled by federal agents in Connecticut, and this receptionist was the only thing standing between her and her only piece of leverage. The wealthy grandmother facade shattered completely, revealing the vicious entitled abuser underneath. "Do you know who I am?" Barbara shrieked, leaning over the desk and pointing a shaking finger at Brenda's face. "I am a millionaire. I can buy this entire building and fire you before lunch. You are holding my granddaughter hostage. You are a glorified secretary, and you have absolutely no right to keep me from my own blood. I demand you go into that classroom and bring Lily to me this instant, or I will sue this institution into bankruptcy." Brenda did not flinch. She picked up the heavy telephone receiver, keeping her eyes locked directly on Barbara's flushed, furious face. "Security to the front desk, please," Brenda said calmly into the phone. "We have a hostile individual attempting an unauthorized pickup." Barbara gasped, stepping back from the counter as if she had been struck. She looked wildly toward the hallway leading to the classrooms, calculating whether she could simply run past the desk and snatch Lily herself. She took one aggressive step forward, her expensive leather shoes squeaking against the polished floor. "I would not take another step if I were you, Mother." Barbara froze completely. Her expensive leather shoes halted just inches from the security gates leading to the kindergarten classrooms. Her neck snapped toward the source of the voice. I stepped out from the frosted glass doors of the principal's private office, walking slowly into the brightly lit reception area. I was still wearing the same razor-sharp black power suit I had worn to the mansion just an hour earlier. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of absolute corporate dominance. I had beaten her here. I had beaten her to the one place she thought she could establish leverage. Barbara's jaw dropped. The color completely drained from her heavily powdered face. She looked at me as if I had just materialized out of thin air. Lauren Barbara gasped, her voice losing every ounce of its previous venom and dropping into a pathetic, breathless wheeze. "How did you get here? You were just at the house. You were with the police." I walked past the reception desk, giving Brenda a brief, polite nod of gratitude. Brenda immediately lowered the telephone receiver, visibly relieved that the situation was now entirely under my control. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from my mother, invading her personal space, just enough to make her physically recoil. I took a private helicopter from the estate directly to the Manhattan helipad. I stated flatly, my eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. "It is amazing what kind of logistical miracles you can pull off when your bank accounts are not frozen under federal investigation." Barbara stammered, her hands shaking wildly as she clutched her designer handbag against her chest. "Where is Lily? I demand to see my granddaughter. We need to talk, Lauren. We need to sit down as a family and fix this massive misunderstanding. You have made your point. You scared your father. You scared DeAndre. Now bring me Lily so we can all go home and negotiate like rational adults." She was still trying to play the game. She was still trying to spin a narrative where she held a seat at the negotiating table. The absolute delusion was staggering. "Lily is not here," I replied, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. I dispatched my private security detail to pull her out of class an hour ago, long before I even stepped foot in your dining room. She is currently eating a massive chocolate sundae in a secure, undisclosed location, completely oblivious to the pathetic kidnapping attempt happening in her school lobby. Barbara flinched as if I had physically struck her across the face. Kidnapping Lauren, do not be insane. I am her grandmother. I came here to protect her from you. You are having a mental breakdown. You are destroying our family over some petty fabricated grudge. You came here to use a 5-year-old child as a human shield. I corrected her sharply, cutting off her hysterical lies. You watched your empire burn to the ground this morning. You watched your golden son Cameron cry on the hardwood floor. You realized you had absolutely zero financial power left, so you ran to the only place where you thought you could steal back some leverage. You wanted to hold my daughter hostage to force me to drop the federal charges. Barbara's eyes darted frantically around the lobby. 2 broad-shouldered school security guards had just stepped out from the nearby elevator bank, responding to Brenda's earlier call. They stood silently a few feet away, their arms crossed, waiting for my signal. Barbara realized the trap had closed around her once again. She was completely surrounded. Her chest heaved as panic finally began to override her lifelong arrogance. "You cannot keep me away from her!" Barbara hissed, dropping the concerned grandmother act entirely. The venom returned to her voice, sharp and bitter. "I have grandparents' rights. I will hire a family lawyer. I will drag you through family court until you are bankrupt. You think you are so smart, Lauren. You think you can just erase me. I am your mother. You owe me respect." I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope bearing the official seal of the New York State Supreme Court. I did not hand it to her gently. I slapped it hard against her chest, forcing her to grab it instinctively before it fell to the floor. "Did you really think I would leave my daughter unprotected?" I asked, leaning in so close she could feel the absolute ice in my words. "This is an emergency restraining order. A federal judge signed it at 7 o'clock this morning after reviewing the overwhelming evidence of your massive financial fraud and the calculated flight risk you posed." Barbara stared down at the thick envelope in her trembling hands. The bold black lettering on the front page was undeniable. "If you come within 500 feet of her again, you will go to jail," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with crystal clear precision. "If you attempt to call her school, you will go to jail. If you so much as send a piece of mail to my apartment, you will be arrested on the spot. You have no legal rights. You have no money to hire a lawyer. You have absolutely nothing." The heavy envelope seemed to weigh 100 pounds in Barbara's hands. She stared at the federal judge's signature, her mind completely short-circuiting. For 33 years, Barbara had controlled every aspect of my existence. She had dictated my worth, mocked my choices, and used my grief as a weapon to elevate her own status. She had operated with the absolute certainty that I was a weak, submissive failure who would never dare to fight back. Looking at me now, she finally realized the catastrophic magnitude of her miscalculation. She had absolutely zero control over the daughter she had abused. I was not just immune to her manipulation. I was the architect of her total destruction. "I do not understand." Barbara whispered, her voice cracking into a hollow, defeated rasp. "You were supposed to be the quiet one. You were supposed to fail." I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey finally stop struggling. "I did fail, Mother," I replied smoothly. "I failed to be the pathetic victim you desperately needed me to be." I turned my head and gave a sharp nod to the 2 security guards waiting in the hallway. They immediately stepped forward, flanking Barbara on both sides. "Ma'am, you need to vacate the premises immediately," the taller guard ordered, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "If you do not walk out those doors right now, we will physically remove you and contact the authorities to enforce the active court order." Barbara looked wildly at the guards, then back at me. She opened her mouth to argue, to scream, to throw one last desperate insult, but no words came out. The sheer crushing reality of her absolute powerlessness finally broke her spirit. Her shoulders slumped forward. She looked incredibly old, fragile, and utterly pathetic. She clutched the restraining order to her chest, turned around, and walked slowly toward the glass exit doors. As the security guards escorted her out, a group of wealthy elite parents arrived for a mid-morning PTA meeting. They stood on the sidewalk in their designer coats, watching in stunned silence, as Barbara, a woman who prided herself on high society prestige, was publicly and humiliatingly marched off the school grounds like a common criminal. The social execution was absolute. I turned back to Brenda, the receptionist, who was watching the scene with quiet awe. "Thank you for your professionalism today, Brenda," I said, offering her a genuine, polite smile. "My security team will remain posted outside the building for the rest of the week, just as a precaution." "Of course," Miss Lauren, Brenda replied, nodding respectfully. "Have a wonderful day." I walked out of the school through a side exit, completely avoiding the spectacle on the main sidewalk. My black SUV was idling perfectly at the curb, the engine purring softly. Harrison opened the rear door for me. I slid into the leather seat, feeling a profound, incredible sense of peace wash over my entire body. The first half of my war was officially over. "Are we returning to the office?" Harrison asked, reviewing a new set of digital documents on his tablet. "No," I replied, looking out the tinted window as the SUV pulled seamlessly into the bustling Manhattan traffic. "We need to prepare for Friday." DeAndre and Richard still think they can save themselves by hosting their annual charity gala. They think they can squeeze emergency cash out of naive investors to fight the federal indictments. I leaned back against the plush leather headrest, a dangerous, calculating energy returning to my veins. "Let them prep for their party," I said softly. "We have a presentation to build." Friday evening arrived with the suffocating humidity typical of a New York summer. But the climate inside the executive suite of the Waldorf Astoria was entirely controlled. The suite had been booked and paid for 6 months in advance, under the official name of the Blackwell Family Foundation, effectively shielding it from the immediate blast radius of my federal asset freeze. It was the only sanctuary my family had left. The 48-hour eviction notice I delivered on Monday had been ruthlessly enforced by Wednesday afternoon. Federal marshals had physically escorted my parents out of their Connecticut mansion, forcing them to leave behind almost everything they owned. Now they were living out of hastily packed designer suitcases scattered across the hotel room floor. Despite facing active federal indictments, frozen bank accounts, and the total collapse of their empire, Richard and DeAndre absolutely refused to surrender. Delusion is a powerful narcotic for the wealthy. They had convinced themselves that this was simply a temporary liquidity crisis, a bureaucratic misunderstanding that could be easily resolved with the right amount of cash and the right handshake. They decided to push forward with their annual high society charity gala. DeAndre stood in front of the gilded floor-to-ceiling mirror in the suite, violently yanking his silk bow tie into a perfect knot. His eyes were bloodshot from 4 consecutive days without sleep, and a manic, desperate energy radiated from his entire body. He looked at Richard, who was sitting on the edge of a velvet sofa, staring blankly at a leather-bound guest list. "We focus on the whales tonight, Richard." DeAndre ordered, his voice sharp and erratic. "The SEC works slowly. They are bureaucrats. We just need enough liquid capital to hire a Tier 1 defense firm to stall the indictments and unfreeze the secondary shell accounts." Richard wiped a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. He looked incredibly frail, completely swallowed by his custom tuxedo. "Are you sure about this?" DeAndre, committing wire fraud through a registered charity event, while we are already under federal surveillance, is incredibly dangerous. If they catch us funneling donations, they are not going to catch us, DeAndre snapped, cutting him off aggressively. He turned away from the mirror, pacing the length of the room. "I set up a blind trust in the Bahamas yesterday, using a burner proxy. When these naive billionaires write their 6-figure checks tonight for our fake youth technology initiative, those funds are bouncing through 3 different international routing numbers before they hit the shadow account. We pull the cash, we hire the lawyers, and we bury Lauren in endless litigation." Barbara emerged from the master bedroom, struggling to clasp a heavy diamond necklace around her throat. It was one of the few pieces of jewelry she had managed to shove into her purse before the federal marshals locked the estate. Her face was heavily contoured to hide the dark, exhausted circles under her eyes. "I cannot believe we are doing this," Barbara whispered, her hands shaking as she looked at her husband. "My bridge club friends are going to be downstairs. What if they heard the rumors? What if they know we were evicted?" "They do not know anything," Richard barked suddenly, finding a reserve of his old patriarchal authority. He stood up and grabbed Barbara by the shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "You put on a smile. You drink the champagne. You act like you are the wealthiest woman in the room. We built this family on prestige, and prestige is exactly what is going to save us. Everything will be fixed by Monday." Brittany sat on the edge of the bed, crying quietly into a hotel towel. She was wearing a stunning scarlet evening gown, but her usual arrogant demeanor was completely shattered. "I tried to book my regular makeup artist," she sobbed, but her assistant demanded a cash deposit. "We do not have any cash, DeAndre. I am wearing last year's dress. I feel like a peasant." DeAndre rolled his eyes, utterly disgusted by his wife's vanity in the face of federal prison. "Pull yourself together, Brittany. You are a Davis. Act like it. Tonight is about survival. You go down to that ballroom, you target the tech investors, and you smile until your face hurts. We are going to bleed these rich idiots dry." They genuinely believed their elite status made them invincible. They had spent decades stealing, lying, and manipulating their way to the top of the social ladder. They assumed the wealthy guests attending the gala would protect them simply because they wore the same expensive brands and attended the same exclusive country clubs. They thought the rules of consequence did not apply to people in tailored tuxedos. DeAndre checked his gold watch, the final remnant of his stolen wealth. "It is time. Let us go down there and remind this city who we are." The family filed out of the suite, stepping into the private elevator. They adjusted their posture, forcing their spines completely straight. They masked their terror behind practiced, brilliant smiles. As the elevator doors slid open to the grand ballroom level, the sound of a live string quartet and clinking crystal washed over them. The gala was an absolute spectacle of excessive wealth. Massive floral arrangements towered over tables draped in gold silk. Hundreds of New York's elite investors, politicians, and socialites mingled near the open bars, completely unaware that the hosts of the evening were utterly destitute criminals attempting to orchestrate a massive financial heist right in front of them. DeAndre grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. He looked at Richard and nodded confidently. "Let us go to work." They waded into the crowd, deploying their fake charm and rehearsed elevator pitches. They shook hands, kissed cheeks, and poured poison into the ears of every wealthy donor they could corner. They felt the power returning to their veins. They thought they had successfully escaped the nightmare. They had absolutely no idea that I was already inside the building. I had arrived 2 hours before the first guest even handed their keys to the valet. Through my connections at the private equity firm, I knew the event manager for the Waldorf Astoria. A simple phone call backed by the weight of a federal investigation granted me full, unrestricted access to the venue. I spent the cocktail hour standing in the shadows of the mezzanine balcony, completely out of sight, looking down at the magnificent ballroom as my family desperately tried to con their way out of a federal indictment. At 8:30 in the evening, the string quartet faded into silence. The heavy crystal chandeliers dimmed slightly, casting a warm, theatrical glow over the crowd. DeAndre walked up the short steps to the main stage. He adjusted his microphone, his posture exuding absolute confidence. He looked like a man who had everything under control, a visionary leader ready to inspire the masses. "Thank you all for being here tonight." DeAndre began, his voice resonating through the massive speakers. His tone was perfectly calibrated, warm, humble, and deeply persuasive. "We gather here every year not just as investors, but as a family. The Blackwell Family Foundation was built on a very simple premise: trust. We believe in leaving a legacy. We believe that true wealth is measured not by what we accumulate, but by what we give back to the next generation." I gripped the velvet railing of the balcony. The sheer hypocrisy of his words was physically nauseating. He was standing on a stage preaching about trust and family values while actively attempting to launder millions of dollars to save himself from a prison sentence for stealing a dead man's intellectual property. DeAndre paced the stage, slowly making direct eye contact with the wealthiest individuals in the room. Tonight we are launching our most ambitious initiative, yet he continued pressing his hand against his chest in a gesture of fake sincerity. A global technology fund for underprivileged youth. We want to put the same predictive software and educational tools that built my own firm into the hands of children who have nothing. But we cannot do it alone. We need your partnership. We need your open hearts. And quite frankly, your open checkbooks. We are asking for immediate liquid capital donations tonight. Every single dollar you pledge will be transferred directly into our newly established global trust by midnight. He was openly soliciting wire transfers into the Bahamian shadow account right in front of federal informants. It was the most arrogant, suicidal financial move I had ever witnessed. Down in the front row, Richard and Barbara were clapping enthusiastically. Barbara wiped a perfectly manufactured tear from her eye. Brittany was smiling brilliantly, practically calculating how many designer bags she could buy once the donations cleared the offshore routing process. They honestly thought the scam was working. They watched the elite guests pulling out their checkbooks and whispering to their wealth managers. The room was buzzing with the electric energy of rich people eager to buy a tax write-off. It was time to end the show. I turned away from the balcony and walked swiftly down the carpeted back staircase. I bypassed the main lobby and moved into the service corridor that led directly to the rear entrance of the grand ballroom. I was not wearing my black corporate armor tonight. For this execution, I needed to be entirely visible. I wore a floor-length custom-designed gown in a shade of brilliant, unapologetic crimson red. It was a dress meant to draw every single eye in the room. I paired it with diamond drop earrings and the exact sapphire necklace Richard had once told me I was too plain to pull off. I stopped in front of the massive gold-leafed double doors at the back of the ballroom. 2 hotel security guards stood on either side. I flashed my corporate identification and gave them a sharp, authoritative nod. They grasped the heavy brass handles and pulled the doors wide open. The sudden influx of bright light from the hallway spilled into the dim, candlelit ballroom. The heavy thud of the doors swinging open caused several guests near the back to turn their heads. I stepped over the threshold. The crimson gown practically glowed against the sea of monotonous black tuxedos and muted pastel dresses. I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom with absolute unwavering purpose. My heels clicked softly against the hardwood sections of the floor. I did not rush. I took my time, allowing the shockwave of my presence to ripple through the crowd. Whispers immediately broke out among the guests. People nudged their partners, pointing in my direction. They did not know who I was, but they recognized power when it walked into a room. DeAndre was still speaking on stage, but his words began to falter as he noticed the shifting attention of his audience. He looked toward the back of the room, squinting through the harsh stage lights. When his eyes finally locked onto the red dress, his voice completely died in his throat. The microphone picked up his sharp, terrified intake of breath. The sudden dead silence from the speaker system caused the rest of the room to turn around. I walked directly past the front tables. I made brief eye contact with Barbara. Her champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering against the base of her table. The glass sprayed everywhere, but she did not even blink. She just stared at me, her face contorting in absolute horror. Brittany actually whimpered, shrinking back into her chair as I passed. Richard looked like he was having a stroke. I did not stop to acknowledge any of them. I kept my eyes locked on the stage, maintaining my steady, predatory pace. Instead of walking up the central stairs to confront DeAndre at the podium, I took a sharp left turn. I bypassed the stage entirely and headed straight for the elevated audio-visual booth tucked into the dark alcove near the curtain. A young technician wearing a headset was frantically pressing buttons, trying to figure out why the keynote speaker had suddenly gone completely mute. He looked up startled as I pushed open the low gate and stepped into the cramped booth. "Ma'am, you cannot be back here," the technician stammered, pulling off his headset. This is a restricted production area. I reached into the bodice of my gown and pulled out a sleek silver flash drive. I placed it firmly onto the primary control console right next to his hand. I am the legal representative of the holding company that owns this foundation. I stated, my voice projecting absolute command. I need you to plug this drive into the main projection system and push the master feed to all 5 screens in this ballroom immediately. The technician hesitated, looking nervously toward the stage where DeAndre was standing completely paralyzed. I do not have clearance for a media change during the keynote pitch. Mr. Davis said no interruptions. Mr. Davis no longer signs your paychecks, I replied coldly, leaning closer to the terrified technician. I do. Plug it in, switch the feed to channel 1 and maximize the audio output. Do it right now. The technician swallowed hard, intimidated by the sheer force of my presence. He grabbed the silver flash drive and shoved it into the main server port. His fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the scheduled slideshow. I looked out the small window of the AV booth. DeAndre was gripping the podium, sweating profusely, staring at me like a man standing on the tracks watching a freight train barrel toward him. He knew exactly what was on that drive. He knew the charade was officially over. The massive digital screens behind him flickered for a brief second. Then the presentation went live. The 5 massive LED screens suspended above the stage illuminated the dark ballroom with a glaring clinical white light. Gone were the carefully curated stock photos of smiling underprivileged children that DeAndre had planned to use to emotionally manipulate his donors. In their place were high-resolution, undeniably authentic bank records. The screens displayed pages of international wire transfers, complete with bright yellow highlights and bold red circles around the receiving account numbers. The headers clearly showed the name of the family foundation, but the destination accounts were registered in the Cayman Islands under a completely different corporate entity. DeAndre froze. He slowly turned his head to look at the screens behind him. His jaw went entirely slack. The towering displays showed a real-time ledger of every single donation collected at this exact charity gala over the past 4 years. Right next to those incoming deposits were the corresponding outgoing wire transfers, moving the exact same amounts out of the charity fund and directly into a private wealth management account owned exclusively by DeAndre and my father, Richard. A low murmur of confusion rippled through the sea of wealthy guests. Elite investors adjusted their glasses, squinting at the glowing numbers. The confusion rapidly curdled into suspicion. I stepped out of the audio-visual booth, holding a sleek wireless microphone. I walked to the very edge of the mezzanine balcony, the crimson fabric of my gown catching the spotlights. I stood directly above the crowd, looking down at the magnificent ballroom like a judge presiding over a courtroom. I raised the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing powerfully through the state-of-the-art sound system completely dominating the room. "Before you write your checks tonight, you might want to ask the hosts how they paid for the Porsche parked outside using your children's hospital donations." The murmur in the ballroom instantly transformed into a sharp collective gasp. Several hundred heads snapped up to look at me standing on the balcony. DeAndre whipped his head back toward the crowd. He tapped his own microphone, frantically trying to interrupt me, but the AV technician had already cut his feed entirely at my strict command. DeAndre opened his mouth to shout, but without amplification, his voice was completely swallowed by the sheer size of the room and the growing outrage of the audience. "Please direct your attention to the center screen." I continued pacing slowly along the balcony railing. "What you are looking at is the complete financial roadmap of the foundation. You will notice a highly repetitive pattern. Let us take last year's gala, for example. The foundation raised $2.4 million allegedly to build a pediatric oncology wing. However, if you look at the routing numbers highlighted in red, you will see that exactly 48 hours after the gala ended, $2.4 million was wired to a shell corporation in the Bahamas. I paused, letting the devastating truth sink into the minds of the furious billionaires below me. That shell corporation, I stated clearly, is a holding company registered to my father, Richard, and my brother-in-law, DeAndre. That pediatric oncology money never bought a single hospital bed. Instead, it purchased my sister Brittany a custom diamond necklace, and it secured my father's platinum tier membership at his exclusive country club, You did not fund a charity, ladies and gentlemen. You funded their luxury lifestyle. The ballroom erupted. The wealthy elite do not tolerate being stolen from. A billionaire sitting in the front row slammed his champagne glass onto his table so hard the stem snapped. Another prominent real estate developer pulled out his cell phone, aggressively dialing his legal team. The carefully maintained atmosphere of high society elegance completely shattered, replaced by the chaotic, vicious reality of rich people realizing they had been conned. I looked down at the front tables. Barbara was gripping the edge of her table, her face buried in her hands, desperately trying to hide from the glaring eyes of her peers. Brittany was hyperventilating, staring at the screens in sheer horror as the exact purchase order for her jewelry flashed across the digital display. Cameron and Allison had physically backed away from the family table, attempting to blend into the angry crowd, terrified of being associated with the blast radius of this financial nuclear bomb. DeAndre was completely unhinged. The polished, charismatic Ivy League graduate was gone. He was pacing the stage like a cornered animal, waving his arms at the AV booth, screaming without a working microphone for someone to shut off the screens. He looked out at the furious crowd, watching the exact people he needed to save him, actively turning against him. He had banked his entire survival on this single night, and I had just turned it into his public execution. And for those of you who were considering investing in DeAndre's flagship hedge fund this evening, I announced, my voice slicing through the rising clamor of the ballroom. You should know that his primary domestic accounts were frozen by the Securities and Exchange Commission at 8:59 this morning. He is currently under an active federal investigation for wire fraud and international money laundering. Any capital you hand him tonight will immediately be seized by the United States government as evidence. I lowered the microphone. The execution was flawless. Every single lie they had ever told, every piece of fake prestige they had ever built, was completely eradicated. They had spent a decade treating me like an uneducated, worthless burden. They had stolen my husband's legacy and used it to prop up their arrogant delusions. Now the entire world knew exactly what they were. They were not titans of industry. They were cheap thieves wearing expensive suits, and their reign of terror was officially over. DeAndre looked up at me standing on the balcony. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a terrifying primal rage. He realized he had absolutely no way out. The money was gone. His reputation was obliterated. The federal agents were undoubtedly already building his indictment. He had lost everything, and he knew I was the one holding the match. He let out a visceral, aggressive roar that echoed over the angry crowd. He jumped down from the stage, shoving a waiter out of his way, and charged directly toward the grand staircase leading up to my balcony. DeAndre took the first few velvet steps, two at a time, his polished dress shoes slipping slightly on the plush carpet. He was completely unhinged. The sophisticated investment banker who had just quoted economic theory was gone. In his place was a desperate, cornered predator acting on pure, reckless adrenaline. He tore off his silk bow tie, throwing it onto the floor, and screamed a string of violent profanities that echoed over the chaotic noise of the ballroom. Below him, the absolute panic of the financial elite intensified. Wealthy investors were physically shoving past each other to reach the exit, holding their cell phones to their ears. I could hear them shouting at their wealth managers to cancel checks, freeze wire transfers, and flag the family foundation for immediate fraud. The elite society that my parents and DeAndre had relied on for survival was actively tearing them apart. "I will end you, Lauren," DeAndre roared, his voice cracking with exertion as he charged up the grand staircase. "You think you can take my company? You think you can take my money? I built this empire. You are nothing. I will throw you off this balcony myself." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the ornate railing. I did not step back. I did not break eye contact. I let him expend the very last drop of his fabricated power. He was 10 steps away from the mezzanine landing when the illusion of his control finally snapped. Two massive hotel security guards intercepted him from the side hallway, grabbing his arms. DeAndre fought back violently, swinging his elbow into the jaw of the first guard and tearing the sleeve of his custom tuxedo jacket in the process. He was completely out of his mind, driven by the terrifying realization that his entire life was over. He lunged forward again, his eyes wild, his hands outstretched toward my throat, desperate to silence me. He made it exactly 2 more steps. 3 men in perfectly tailored tuxedos who had been quietly standing near the ballroom exits all evening surged forward with terrifying speed. They were not wealthy guests. They were the undercover federal agents I had personally tipped off 48 hours ago. The lead agent tackled DeAndre squarely in the chest, driving him backward down the stairs. DeAndre hit the landing with a brutal, heavy thud that knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. Before he could even attempt to struggle, the other 2 agents were on top of him. They pinned his arms sharply behind his back, pressing his face directly into the carpet. "Federal agents, stay down the lead!" Investigator shouted, his voice cutting cleanly through the screams of the remaining guests. DeAndre Davis, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud and money laundering. Do not resist. DeAndre gasped for air, his cheeks smashed against the floor, absolutely defeated. The billionaire facade was completely destroyed, replaced by the pathetic reality of a broken criminal. The camera flashes ignited the dark ballroom like a violent lightning storm. DeAndre had invited the local media and elite financial press to document his philanthropic triumph. He wanted front-page coverage for his fake charity initiative. Instead, he gave them front-row seats to a spectacular federal takedown. Journalists shoved past the fleeing billionaires, their heavy camera lenses pointed directly at the grand staircase. Every major news network in the city captured the precise moment the arrogant investment banker was handcuffed and dragged to his feet by federal agents. The sleek custom tuxedo he wore was torn at the shoulder, his face smeared with dust from the carpet. He looked directly into the blinking red recording light of a broadcast camera, his expression one of absolute trapped desperation. Down on the main floor, the media frenzy quickly descended upon my parents. Reporters thrust microphones into Richard's face, shouting aggressive questions about the Cayman Islands wire transfers, still blazing on the massive projection screens above. Richard stumbled backward, throwing his trembling hands up to shield his face from the blinding flashes. He looked incredibly small, a weak, fraudulent old man, completely stripped of the wealth he had used to terrorize his own blood. Barbara attempted to hide behind a toppled floral arrangement, weeping openly as the cameras relentlessly documented her complete social execution. Brittany shrank into the corner, desperately trying to cover her face with her designer clutch, fully aware that her entire luxury lifestyle was evaporating on a live news feed. I stood at the railing of the mezzanine balcony, looking down at the absolute wreckage of my toxic family. The red silk of my gown stood out sharply against the dim shadows of the alcove. I raised the wireless microphone one last time. The heavy booming sound of my voice instantly cut through the chaotic shouting of the journalists and the panicked cries of the remaining guests. "You told me I was a useless dropout," I stated, my voice echoing off the high gilded ceilings with absolute terrifying clarity. "You told me my husband's life amounted to nothing. Today, the world sees exactly what you are." The cameras immediately pivoted upward, capturing my face looking down at them with cold, unwavering judgment. I did not yell. I did not show a single ounce of sorrow. I delivered the final blow with the precise, calculated efficiency of the corporate weapon they forced me to become. Richard stared up at me, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as the reporters cornered him against the serving tables. He finally understood the true cost of his arrogance. They had built their entire identity on the illusion of prestige, relying on fake wealth to command respect. Now that exact same prestige had become their permanent public ruin. The footage of their arrest and financial execution would be broadcast on every evening news channel across the country. There was no coming back from this. Their empire was dead. 1 week later, the Grand Connecticut mansion was completely empty, padlocked by the federal government, with bright yellow seizure tape stretched across the heavy oak doors. The surviving members of my family were crammed into a tiny fluorescent-lit conference room at a public defender's office in downtown Manhattan. They could no longer afford private counsel. The suffocating tension in the small room was explosive. Cameron sat at the far end of the cheap laminate table, pale and sweating, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. He had spent the last 48 hours singing to the federal prosecutors. To save himself from a lengthy prison sentence, my cowardly older brother handed over every single fabricated invoice, every hidden email, and every wire transfer receipt connecting DeAndre and Richard to the stolen funds. He gladly traded his family's freedom for his own full legal immunity. "You spineless rat!" Brittany shrieked, slamming her hands against the table. She lunged across the cramped space toward Allison, her manicured nails frantically clawing the stale air. "Your pathetic husband just signed DeAndre's death warrant. You promised we were a team." Allison slapped Brittany's hands away, her face twisted in pure, unadulterated disgust. "Do not touch me, Brittany." DeAndre dragged Cameron into this mess. He used my husband as a disposable human shield. We are not going to jail just so your fraudulent husband can pretend to be a Wall Street god. In the corner of the room, the matriarch and patriarch of the family were actively tearing each other apart. Barbara turned on Richard with a level of venom I had never seen before. "You told me it was handled, Richard," she spat, her voice trembling with absolute fury. "You told me 10 years ago that Lauren was too stupid to ever figure out the patent transfer. Now I am sleeping on a stained mattress in a cheap motel. You ruined my life." Richard stared back at her, his posture completely defeated, but his temper flared defensively. "I gave you the exact luxury you begged for, Barbara. You gladly spent that stolen insurance money every single day for a decade. You enjoyed the country club. You enjoyed the cars. Do not play the innocent victim now. You are just as guilty as I am." The toxic family unit, once held together exclusively by stolen money and a shared superiority complex, was actively devouring itself. Without my husband's wealth to prop them up, there was no loyalty, no love, and absolutely no unity. They were just greedy, desperate criminals fighting over the pathetic scraps of a destroyed illusion. DeAndre and Richard were formally indicted on 32 counts of federal wire fraud and conspiracy. They were facing decades behind bars. The mighty titans of industry had finally fallen, and the absolute best part of my victory was knowing that they had to watch each other pull the trigger. The heavy torrential rain pounded relentlessly against the reinforced glass of my Tribeca high-rise. It was late Friday evening. The storm outside matched the absolute devastation I had unleashed upon my bloodline. I was sitting in my penthouse reviewing the final asset forfeiture documents when the private line on my desk chimed. It was the lobby concierge. My security protocol required them to notify me of any unauthorized visitors attempting to bypass the perimeter. I took the private elevator down to the ground floor. I stepped into the warm, brilliantly lit lobby and walked slowly toward the towering double-glass doors. Outside, standing on the slick, rain-soaked pavement, were the remnants of my toxic family. Richard, Barbara, and Brittany huddled together under the harsh glow of the street lamp. They were completely soaked to the bone. The expensive designer clothes they had salvaged from the wreckage hung heavy and ruined on their shivering frames. Barbara's immaculate hair was plastered flat against her skull. Richard looked incredibly frail, clutching his soaked coat around his neck. Brittany stood shivering, her makeup running down her face in dark, pathetic streaks. The towering arrogance that had defined their entire existence was entirely gone, washed away into the Manhattan gutters. I stood safely inside the lobby, perfectly warm and completely untouchable. I did not push the heavy glass doors open. I did not invite them in from the cold. I simply pressed the silver button on the interior security console, activating the two-way external intercom. "Lauren, please!" Barbara's voice crackled through the speaker, distorted by her desperate heaving sobs and the relentless downpour. She pressed her wet hands against the thick security glass, leaving frantic, smudged handprints. "We have nowhere else to go. You have to let us in." I stared at her hands on the glass, remembering the moment she tossed an empty plastic egg at my daughter. I remained absolutely silent. "Please, Lauren," Richard begged, stepping forward and shoving his face close to the intercom box. His voice shook violently, stripped of all its former patriarchal power. "We are family. DeAndre is going to prison. Your father will die in jail. You have to drop the lawsuit. You have to tell the federal prosecutors to back down. Brittany pushed past her father, grabbing the metal speaker box. She was weeping hysterically, the reality of her impending poverty finally crushing her entitlement. I cannot work a minimum wage job, Lauren. You cannot make me live like this. We will do anything you want. Just give us the money back. They stood in the freezing rain, begging the very woman they had relentlessly abused and discarded. They expected my fundamental decency to override their decade of calculated cruelty. They thought the word family was a magic key that would instantly unlock my forgiveness and reverse their absolute financial ruin. I stood there watching the rain plaster their designer clothes against their shivering bodies. They truly believed that blood was a binding contract, a guaranteed safety net they could exploit after spending a decade treating me like a disposable asset. I looked at my mother's tear-streaked face, her makeup completely ruined by the brutal storm. I looked at my father's desperate hollow eyes stripped of the corporate arrogance that had dictated my entire childhood. I looked at Brittany, who was shaking with the fear of having to actually work for a living. They were not begging for my forgiveness. They were begging for my bank account. They missed the stolen wealth, not the daughter they cast aside. Their tears were entirely manufactured from the sheer terror of facing federal prison and poverty, lacking any genuine remorse for the devastation they had inflicted upon my life and my innocent child. I reached into the deep pocket of my tailored suit jacket. My fingers closed around the smooth, neon yellow plastic. I had carried it with me every single day since that horrific Easter brunch. It was the ultimate symbol of their cruelty, the exact measure of my daughter's worth in their eyes. I gripped it tightly, feeling the cheap plastic seam pressing into my palm, grounding me in my absolute resolve. I stepped forward and pushed the heavy glass security door open just a few inches. The freezing wind immediately whipped into the warm lobby, bringing with it the smell of rain-wet asphalt and their palpable desperation. The sudden movement made all three of them gasp in desperate hope. They surged forward, thinking I was finally opening the gates to their salvation. Richard reached his hand out, a pathetic, trembling gesture of false paternal affection. Barbara let out a sharp cry of relief, attempting to push a soaked strand of hair out of her eyes, her face lighting up with a sickeningly triumphant smile. Brittany took a step toward the gap in the door, her eyes fixed on me with a ravenous, hungry anticipation. They thought my cold exterior had finally cracked under the pressure of their weeping. I did not open the door any further. I raised my hand and tossed the neon yellow plastic Easter egg through the narrow gap. It hit the wet concrete right at my father's soaking wet leather shoes. It bounced once, making a distinct mocking sound against the pavement, before rolling to a stop perfectly between Richard and Barbara. The bright yellow color stood out violently against the dark rain-slicked street. The three of them froze entirely, staring down at the cheap piece of plastic as if it were an explosive device. Barbara recognized it instantly. The desperate hope completely drained from her face, replaced by a fresh wave of absolute terror. She looked up at me, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly, the devastating reality of her own actions crashing down upon her. She finally understood that I had kept the exact weapon she used to break my daughter's heart, and I was now using it to seal her ultimate destruction. I looked directly into my mother's panicked eyes, my voice carrying cleanly over the sound of the torrential downpour. Family does not steal a dead man's life insurance. I stated my words, striking them like physical blows. Family does not forge legal documents to rob a grieving widow of her only financial safety net while pretending to handle hospital bills. Family does not take a stolen predictive algorithm and build an empire of lies, forcing the actual creator's wife into poverty. Family does not humiliate a 5-year-old child at a lavish estate with an empty plastic egg to satisfy some twisted sadistic superiority complex. I shifted my gaze to Richard, who was staring at the plastic egg as if his entire soul had just been crushed into the concrete. "You chose money over me," I told him, my voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth or hesitation. "You chose the illusion of power. You chose the prestige and the luxury cars paid for with my husband's blood. You traded your own daughter for a stolen lifestyle, and now you have neither." Brittany let out a loud, agonizing wail, dropping to her knees right there on the wet pavement. She ignored the freezing puddles soaking through her expensive gown. She reached through the gap in the door, desperately trying to grab the hem of my suit jacket, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her dignity. "Lauren, I am begging you." Brittany sobbed, her fingers clawing frantically at the empty air. "I will be homeless. I have no skills. I do not know how to survive out here. Please do not do this to me." I took a deliberate step backward, easily out of her reach. "You will learn to survive, Brittany," I replied coldly. "Just like I had to learn when you all turned your backs on me. But unlike you, I built my survival on hard work and intelligence, not fraud and theft. Good luck with the federal prosecutors. I hear they do not negotiate with uncooperative targets. And DeAndre will be too busy trading his tailored suits for an orange jumpsuit to offer you any financial advice. You are entirely on your own." I pulled my hand back and let go of the heavy glass door. The automatic pneumatic hinges engaged instantly. The thick glass swung shut with a smooth, decisive motion, the heavy magnetic locks clicking into place with a loud, final echo. The sound severed the last remaining tie I had to the people standing in the rain. I turned my back on them without a single moment of hesitation. I did not watch them sink to the ground. I did not watch Barbara collapse against Richard's chest. I simply walked away, leaving them sobbing in the rain. The justice system moved with a swift and brutal efficiency that my family was entirely unprepared to face. For decades, they genuinely believed their wealth was an impenetrable shield against consequences. But the stolen money was gone, and their shield had completely evaporated. The federal prosecutors did not offer a single ounce of leniency. DeAndre, the arrogant investment banker who thought he could outsmart the market with a stolen algorithm, was systematically stripped of his financial licenses, his frozen assets, and his freedom. During the highly publicized federal trial, his polished Ivy League charm dissolved into pathetic begging. The presiding judge was entirely unmoved by his tears. DeAndre and my father, Richard, were both convicted of multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate conspiracy, and international money laundering. They were swiftly sentenced to 5 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I did not attend the sentencing hearing. I had already watched their fabricated empire crumble to dust, and I had absolutely no interest in watching them trade their custom-tailored suits for standard-issue prison uniforms. Cameron managed to avoid a jail cell by aggressively cooperating with the authorities. To save himself from a lengthy prison sentence, my cowardly older brother turned state's witness, providing the prosecution with every single forged invoice and hidden email connecting DeAndre and Richard to the stolen funds. He gladly traded his father and brother-in-law for his own full legal immunity, but he still lost absolutely everything else. His luxury real estate firm was seized by the government and liquidated entirely to pay criminal restitution. Allison, utterly disgusted by her sudden plunge into poverty and the complete destruction of her social standing, filed for divorce and took their children to live with her parents out of state. Cameron now lives in a tiny, dilapidated studio apartment, working a mid-level administrative job, completely estranged from the toxic family he betrayed to save his own skin. Barbara, the woman who had orchestrated my misery and intentionally humiliated my daughter with an empty plastic egg, found herself permanently exiled from the high society she worshipped. Her wealthy country club friends abandoned her overnight. The elite socialites who used to attend her lavish holiday parties now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact with the disgraced wife of a convicted felon. She was forced to move into a cramped, noisy apartment complex in a deteriorating neighborhood, surviving strictly on a heavily restricted allowance managed by the state. And Brittany, the golden sister who had flaunted her unlimited Black American Express card in my face just moments before her financial execution, faced the harshest reality check of all. Burdened by massive legal debts and entirely devoid of any marketable skills, she was forced to seek minimum wage employment just to survive. She now works full-time at a generic retail clothing store in a suburban strip mall. Every single day, she stands behind a cash register for 8 grueling hours, folding discounted sweaters, and swiping other people's credit cards, slowly chipping away at a colossal mountain of debt she will likely never escape. The heavy, suffocating weight of their toxic existence was permanently erased from my life. I stepped into the bright, brilliant light of my own future. 6 months after the federal trial concluded, I was officially promoted to Managing Director of Corporate Acquisitions at my private equity firm. I utilized my resources to legally buy out the remaining legitimate shares of DeAndre's former holding company, fully integrating my late husband's predictive software into my own highly regulated financial portfolio. The algorithm was finally back where it belonged, securing my daughter's future instead of funding my family's greed. The scene fades to a crisp, clear Friday afternoon. I stood perfectly still in the center of my massive new corner office located on the top floor of a gleaming Manhattan high-rise. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped entirely around the spacious room, offering an unobstructed, breathtaking panoramic view of the New York City skyline. The golden sunlight caught the edges of my modern glass desk and the polished mahogany bookshelves lining the walls. There was no anxiety in this room. There was no fear, no manipulation, and no conditional love. There was only the absolute quiet peace of total victory. I smoothed the front of my tailored emerald green suit and took a deep, steadying breath, absorbing the magnificent view of the city I had conquered. The heavy frosted glass doors of my office swung open with a soft swish. I turned around to see my beautiful daughter Lily bursting into the room. She was wearing a bright yellow sundress, her face lit up with a massive, uncontainable smile. She was holding a gigantic, beautifully wrapped gift box covered in shimmering gold paper with a massive silk ribbon. She was practically vibrating with joy as she ran across the plush carpet toward me. Behind her, walking into the office with warm, genuine smiles, were Harrison Director Mitchell and the rest of my core recovery team. They had organized a spontaneous celebration for my promotion and Lily's recent kindergarten graduation. They had pooled their resources to buy her the ultimate towering toy castle she had been dreaming about for months. The contrast between the spectacular display of affection and the cruel empty plastic egg my mother had given her was profound. They did not view me as a failure or a dropout. They viewed me as a leader, a fiercely loyal partner, and a friend. This was my chosen family. A group of people bound together not by the random accident of genetics or the toxic obligation of blood, but by mutual respect, shared battles, and genuine care. I knelt down to Lily's height, wrapping my arms around her and the massive gold box. I looked up at Harrison and my team, my heart overflowing with profound gratitude. I smiled a genuine, warm, and completely unguarded smile. The dark shadows of my past were entirely gone. I stood back up, adjusting my emerald jacket, and turned my gaze directly toward the camera, locking eyes with you. They called me a failure because I chose silence. But they didn't know that silence isn't weakness, it's the sound of sharpening your weapons. Have you ever been underestimated by your toxic family? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of taking back your power. The story of Lauren and her toxic family powerfully illustrates a profound lesson: silence in the face of abuse should never be mistaken for weakness. For a decade, Lauren endured the condescension and cruelty of a family that stole her late husband's legacy and publicly humiliated her daughter. To them, her lack of immediate retaliation was proof of her defeat. They blindly equated her silence with submission. However, true power often lies not in explosive emotional reactions, but in the quiet, meticulous gathering of strength. When dealing with toxic individuals, especially those who thrive on manipulating emotions and projecting false superiority, reacting with anger only gives them the ammunition they crave. Lauren understood that engaging in their petty, chaotic drama would only diminish her own power. Instead, she chose absolute patience. She allowed them to underestimate her, using their blind arrogance as her greatest tactical advantage. Her silence was never passive. It was deeply active. It was the time she utilized to educate herself, gather irrefutable evidence, and build an impenetrable strategy to reclaim her life. This teaches us a vital reality: we do not owe our abusers an immediate reaction. We have the fundamental right to step back, protect our peace, and strategically plan our next moves without broadcasting our intentions to those who wish to harm us. Ultimately, the narrative reminds us that we possess the agency to define our own worth independent of the damaging labels forced upon us by those who simply share our DNA. By choosing carefully when and how to stand our ground, we can completely dismantle the toxic structures that seek to keep us small and instead surround ourselves with a chosen family that genuinely values us. Take a moment today to evaluate the boundaries in your own life and share your journey of reclaiming your personal power in the comments below.